John Truby'S 22 Steps of Film Story and Screenplay Structure. John Truby created a very detailed story design method called the 22-step story structure. It focuses on character development, moral change, and cause and effect storytelling, rather than only plot events. 1. Self-revelation, need, and desire. This is the foundation of every story, begins with self-revelation, need, and desire. This step focuses on the inner life of the protagonist and establishes the emotional and thematic core of the story. Self-revelation is the moment when the protagonist finally understands the truth about themselves. The protagonist recognizes their true weakness, mistake, or misunderstanding about life. The need refers to what the protagonist must change within themselves in order to grow as a person. This need is usually connected to the character's psychological weakness or moral flaw. The need is often unknown to the protagonist at the beginning of the story. The desire is the protagonist's external goal, the thing they consciously want to achieve in the story. This desire drives the plot forward and gives the character a clear objective. Relationship between self-revelation, need, and desire. A powerful story connects the protagonist's internal need with their external desire. As the protagonist pursues their desire, they are forced to confront their weaknesses and eventually achieve self-revelation. In this way, the external journey of the story leads to the internal transformation of the character. 2. Ghost and Story World. Ghost and story world establish the deeper background of the protagonist and the environment in which the story takes place. This step helps the audience understand why the protagonist behaves the way they do and how the world around them influences the story. Ghost. The ghost refers to an important event or experience from the protagonist's past that still affects them in the present. It is usually a traumatic, painful, or emotionally significant event that shaped the character's personality, beliefs, and weaknesses. The ghost is not always shown directly at the beginning of the story. Sometimes it is revealed slowly through dialogue, flashbacks, or hints in the narrative. The purpose of the ghost is to explain why the protagonist has a certain psychological weakness, why they behave in a particular way, what emotional wounds they carry from the past. Story world. The story world is the environment or setting where the story takes place. It includes the physical location, social structure, culture, and rules that shape the lives of the characters. The story world is not just a background, it influences the characters, conflicts, and events of the story. A well-designed story world should reflect the theme of the story, create unique conflicts and challenges, show how the protagonist fits or does not fit within that world. Relationship between ghost and story world. The ghost explains the protagonist's past, while the story world shows the present environment in which the character must act. Together, they create a strong foundation for the story by answering two key questions. What happened to the protagonist before the story began? What kind of world does the protagonist live in now? These elements deepen the audience's understanding of the character and make the story more emotionally meaningful. 3. Weakness and need. Weakness and need define the internal problem of the protagonist. This step explains what is wrong with the character at the beginning of the story and what they must change in order to grow. Weakness. The weakness is the flaw that prevents the protagonist from living a complete or balanced life. This weakness may be psychological or moral, and it often causes problems for both the protagonist and the people around them. A psychological weakness usually comes from emotional pain, fear, or insecurity. A moral weakness affects how the protagonist treats others. This weakness creates conflict in the story because it limits the protagonist's ability to solve problems and build healthy relationships. Need. The need is what the protagonist must change within themselves in order to overcome their weakness. It represents the internal growth or transformation that the character must achieve by the end of the story. The need is usually not fully understood by the protagonist at the beginning. During the course of the story, the character slowly realizes that their weakness is the real obstacle to their happiness or success. Relationship between weakness and need. The weakness and the need are closely connected. The weakness shows what is wrong with the protagonist. The need shows what the protagonist must learn or change. As the story progresses, the protagonist faces challenges that force them to confront their weakness and eventually recognize their true need. 4. Inciting event. The inciting event is the moment that disturbs the protagonist's normal life and triggers him to involve with the central conflict of the story. As the inciting event triggers the protagonist towards the central conflict of the story, the protagonist begins to develop a clear desire. This desire motivates the protagonist to take action and pursue towards the central conflict. The protagonist first reacts emotionally or defensively to the inciting event before deciding what he truly wants. 5. Desire. Desire refers to the clear external goal that the protagonist wants to achieve in the story. It is the objective that drives the character's actions and moves the plot forward. The protagonist's goal. After the inciting event, the protagonist begins to understand what he wants. This goal becomes the central desire of the story. The protagonist will spend most of the narrative trying to achieve his desire. Once the protagonist has a clear desire, he begins to take actions, make plans, and face obstacles in order to reach that desire. Every major event in the story is usually connected to the protagonist's attempt to fulfill this desire. Conflict with the opponent. In most stories, the protagonist's desire is directly opposed by the antagonist. The antagonist may want the same thing as the protagonist or may try to prevent the protagonist from achieving his desire. This antagonist creates dramatic tension and conflict, which keeps the story engaging. Connection to character growth. Although the protagonist is focused on achieving their external desire, the process of pursuing this goal gradually forces them to confront their internal weakness and deeper need. By the end of the story, the protagonist may realize that achieving the desire is not as important as personal transformation. 6. Allies. Allies are the characters who supports the protagonist in achieving his desire. These characters help the protagonist face challenges, overcome obstacles, and move closer to their desire. Support for the protagonist. Allies assist the protagonist in different ways. They may provide emotional support, practical help, knowledge, or skills that the protagonist does not possess. Because the protagonist cannot succeed alone, allies become an important part of the journey. They help the protagonist develop courage, confidence, and new ideas while facing the antagonist. Creating relationships in the story. Allies are important because they create relationships and interactions within the story. Through conversations and shared experiences, the audience learns more about the protagonist's personality, weaknesses, and beliefs. These relationships also make the story more emotionally engaging, because the audience can see how the protagonist connects with others. Conflict with allies. Even though allies support the protagonist, they do not always agree with them. Sometimes allies challenge the protagonist's decisions or criticize their behavior. This conflict can be important because it forces the protagonist to reflect on his weaknesses and reconsider his actions. Through interactions with allies, the protagonist gradually learns lessons that will eventually lead to self-revelation and personal growth. 7. Antagonist and/or mystery. The antagonist is the character who directly opposes the protagonist and prevents them from achieving their desire. At the same time, many stories also introduce a mystery, which creates curiosity and suspense for the audience. The antagonist. The antagonist is the main opponent of the protagonist. This character has their own goals, motivations, and strategies, which conflict with the protagonist's desire. In strong storytelling, the antagonist is not simply evil. Instead, they are a fully developed character who believes that their actions are justified. Often, the antagonist wants the same goal as the protagonist. Wants something that conflicts with the protagonist's goal. Actively tries to block or defeat the protagonist. Because of this opposition, the story develops dramatic tension and conflict. In many cases, the antagonist is stronger, smarter, or more powerful than the protagonist at the beginning of the story. This makes the protagonist's journey more difficult and forces them to grow, learn, and become stronger. A powerful antagonist creates higher stakes and makes the story more engaging for the audience. Mystery in the story. Some stories include a mystery element, where important information is hidden from the protagonist and the audience. As the story progresses, clues are revealed and the mystery slowly becomes clearer. 8. Fake ally opponent. A fake ally opponent is a character who appears to support the protagonist but is secretly working against them. This character creates hidden conflict and adds complexity to the story. A character with two faces. The fake ally opponent behaves like a friend, helper, or supporter of the protagonist. They may give advice, share information, or work alongside the protagonist in the story. However, their true intention is different. In reality, they are serving their own interests or secretly supporting the antagonist's goal. Because of this double role, the fake ally opponent becomes one of the most dangerous characters in the story, creating suspense and surprise. The presence of a fake ally creates suspense and dramatic tension. The protagonist trusts this character and may even depend on them. When the truth is eventually revealed, it often becomes a major turning point in the story, surprising both the protagonist and the audience. Impact on the protagonist. When the protagonist discovers the betrayal, it can create emotional shock and conflict. The protagonist may feel betrayed, hurt, or misled. This moment often forces the protagonist to rethink their strategy and become more cautious. Importance in storytelling. The fake ally opponent adds depth and unpredictability to the narrative. It shows that not every character can be trusted and that the protagonist must learn to distinguish between true allies and hidden enemies. This element also strengthens the theme of the story by exploring trust, deception, and hidden motives. 9. First revelation and decision. The first revelation and decision is the moment when the protagonist discovers an important piece of new information about the conflict. This revelation changes the protagonist's understanding of the situation and leads them to make a new decision about how to pursue their goal. Discovery of new information. At this stage, the protagonist learns something that they did not know before. This information may reveal a hidden truth about the antagonist, a secret related to the central problem, a clue that changes the direction of the investigation or journey. Because of this revelation, the protagonist begins to see the conflict from a new perspective. Change in strategy. After learning the new information, the protagonist realizes that their previous plan may not work. As a result, they must adjust their strategy or approach in order to continue pursuing their desire. This decision marks an important turning point because the protagonist becomes more active and determined in dealing with the conflict. Strengthening the conflict. The first revelation usually intensifies the story's central conflict. Instead of making the problem easier, the new information often shows that the situation is more complicated or dangerous than the protagonist initially believed. This raises the stakes and increases the dramatic tension. Movement of the plot. Revelations are very important because they move the story forward through discoveries rather than random events. Each revelation leads to a new decision, and each decision creates new actions. This pattern keeps the narrative logical, engaging, and constantly evolving. Importance in storytelling. The first revelation and decision push the protagonist deeper into the story's central conflict. It also begins a chain of discoveries and choices that will eventually lead to the final confrontation with the antagonist. 10. Plan. The plan is the strategy that the protagonist creates in order to achieve his desire and defeat the antagonist. After gaining new information from the first revelation, the protagonist begins to act with a clearer sense of direction. Developing a strategy. At this stage, the protagonist decides how he will pursue their goal. Instead of reacting passively to events, the protagonist now becomes active and strategic. The plan may involve gathering important information, finding allies or resources, setting traps or creating opportunities, preparing for a confrontation with the opponent. This strategy gives the protagonist a practical way to move forward in the conflict. Opposition from the antagonist. While the protagonist creates their plan, the antagonist is also developing their own strategy. Because both characters are trying to achieve their goals, their plans often collide with each other, creating stronger conflict in the story. This opposition makes the journey more challenging for the protagonist. Adjusting the plan. The plan is not always perfect. As the story progresses, unexpected obstacles or revelations may force the protagonist to change or improve their strategy. These adjustments keep the narrative dynamic and unpredictable. Importance in storytelling. The plan is important because it shows the protagonist taking control of the situation. Instead of simply reacting to events, the protagonist is now actively trying to shape the outcome of the story. This stage also increases suspense because the audience begins to wonder whether the protagonist's plan will succeed or fail. 11. Opponent's plan and main counterattack. Opponent's plan and main counterattack is the stage where the antagonist begins to actively respond to the protagonist's actions. The opponent develops their own strategy and launches a strong counterattack that creates greater obstacles for the protagonist. The opponent's strategy. Just like the protagonist, the antagonist also has a clear desire and a strategic plan. At this point in the story, the opponent recognizes the protagonist as a serious threat and begins to take deliberate actions to stop them. The opponent's plan may include blocking the protagonist's progress, b. manipulating other characters, c. creating traps or dangerous situations, d. using power, influence, or deception. These actions make the conflict more intense. The main counterattack. The counterattack is the opponent's direct response to the protagonist's plan. Instead of waiting passively, the antagonist now strikes back in a powerful way. This counterattack often a. weakens the protagonist's position, b. destroys part of the protagonist's plan, c. creates new problems and complications. Because of this attack, the protagonist realizes that the opponent is more powerful or dangerous than they expected. Increasing the stakes. The opponent's counterattack raises the stakes of the story. The conflict becomes more serious, and the protagonist must now work harder, think more carefully, and take greater risks. This stage pushes the story toward higher tension and deeper struggle. Importance in storytelling. This step is important because it shows that the antagonist is an active and intelligent force in the story. The conflict becomes more dramatic when both the protagonist and the antagonist are constantly reacting to each other's strategies. As a result, the story becomes a battle of plans, actions, and decisions between two powerful forces. 12. Drive. The drive is the stage where the protagonist actively moves forward toward their goal while facing a series of obstacles and conflicts. This part of the story usually forms the long middle section of the narrative, where the struggle between the protagonist and the antagonist becomes more intense. Continuous action toward the goal. During the drive, the protagonist continues to pursue their desire with determination. They take repeated actions in order to move closer to their objective. However, every step forward usually brings new challenges, dangers, or complications. The protagonist must constantly adapt and find new ways to overcome these problems. Escalating conflict. The drive is characterized by increasing tension and conflict. As the protagonist moves closer to the goal, the antagonist becomes more active in trying to stop or defeat them. This back-and-forth struggle between the protagonist and the opponent creates a sense of momentum and rising stakes in the story. Tests and obstacles. Throughout the drive, the protagonist faces various tests that challenge their abilities, beliefs, and determination. These tests may include a. physical dangers, b. emotional struggles, c. strategic challenges, d. conflicts with other characters. Each obstacle forces the protagonist to grow stronger, smarter, or more courageous. Character development. The drive is also important for character development. As the protagonist continues their journey, their weakness and need gradually become more visible. The experiences during this stage slowly prepare the protagonist for the major revelations and final confrontation later in the story. Importance in storytelling. The drive keeps the story dynamic and engaging. Instead of a single conflict, the protagonist faces a sequence of challenges, each one pushing the narrative forward. This stage builds the momentum of the story and leads the audience toward the next major turning points. 13. Attack by ally. Attack by ally is the moment when one of the protagonist's allies criticizes, challenges, or confronts the protagonist about their behavior, decisions, or moral choices. Although this ally usually supports the protagonist, at this stage they become a source of conflict in order to push the protagonist toward personal growth. Confrontation from a friend. The attack does not mean physical violence. Instead, it is usually an emotional or verbal confrontation. An ally may express disappointment, anger, or concern about the protagonist's actions. Because the confrontation comes from someone close to them, it has a strong emotional impact. Revealing the protagonist's weakness. This moment often highlights the protagonist's psychological or moral weakness. The ally sees the problem more clearly than the protagonist and tries to force them to recognize their flaw. Sometimes the protagonist reacts defensively and refuses to accept the criticism. In other cases, the confrontation begins to make them question their own behavior. Strengthening character development. The attack by an ally plays an important role in the protagonist's character development. It pushes the protagonist to reflect on their decisions and consider whether they are losing sight of what truly matters. This stage helps prepare the protagonist for the self-revelation that will occur later in the story. Emotional conflict. This moment also creates emotional tension within the protagonist's own group. Instead of only fighting the antagonist, the protagonist must now deal with conflict within their relationships. This internal conflict makes the story more realistic and emotionally complex. Importance in storytelling. The attack by an ally is important because it challenges the protagonist from a moral and emotional perspective. It reminds the audience that the protagonist's greatest obstacle may not only be the external opponent, but also their own flaws and choices. 14. Apparent defeat. Apparent defeat is the moment when the protagonist experiences a major setback that makes it seem as if they have lost the central conflict. At this point, the protagonist's situation becomes extremely difficult, and success appears almost impossible. A major loss. During this stage, the protagonist suffers a serious failure or loss. Their plan may collapse, an important ally may leave or be defeated, or the antagonist may gain a powerful advantage. Because of this event, the protagonist feels that their goal is slipping away. Emotional and psychological impact. The apparent defeat often creates a strong emotional impact on the protagonist. They may feel hopeless, discouraged, or overwhelmed by the situation. This moment can cause the protagonist to question their abilities, choices, or purpose. Strengthening the antagonist. At the same time, the antagonist appears to be winning the battle. Their plan seems to be working, and they may now have greater control over the situation. This shift increases the tension of the story and makes the protagonist's challenge even more serious. Preparing for the next turning point. Although the situation looks hopeless, the apparent defeat is not the final outcome. Instead, it prepares the story for the next important revelation or decision. After reaching this low point, the protagonist must find a new way to continue the struggle. Importance in storytelling. The apparent defeat is important because it creates the lowest emotional point of the protagonist's journey. It tests the protagonist's determination and forces them to rethink their strategy and inner strength. This moment also increases the audience's emotional investment, because they want to see how the protagonist will recover and continue the fight. 15. Second revelation and decision. The second revelation and decision is the moment when the protagonist discovers another important piece of information that changes their understanding of the conflict. This new revelation pushes the protagonist to make a new and stronger decision about how to continue the struggle. Discovery after defeat. This revelation usually occurs after the stage of apparent defeat. At that moment, the protagonist feels discouraged and uncertain about what to do next. Then the protagonist learns a new truth, clue, or insight that changes their perspective on the situation. This information may reveal a hidden motive of the antagonist, a secret related to the central conflict, a new opportunity to challenge the opponent. This discovery gives the protagonist renewed hope and direction. A new decision. After gaining this new understanding, the protagonist decides to take a different course of action. The earlier plan may have failed, but now the protagonist forms a stronger determination to continue the fight. This decision marks a turning point because the protagonist begins to recover from the earlier defeat and prepares for the next phase of the conflict. Deepening the conflict. The second revelation often makes the conflict more intense and complex. Instead of making the situation easier, the new information may show that the stakes are even higher than before. This pushes the protagonist to take greater risks and stronger actions. Importance in storytelling. The second revelation and decision help the story move from despair toward renewed struggle. It shows that the protagonist has not completely given up and is still willing to fight for their goal. This stage also prepares the story for the final series of revelations and the ultimate confrontation with the antagonist. 16. Gate, Gauntlet, Visit to Death. Gate, Gauntlet, Visit to Death is the stage where the protagonist must pass through a series of extreme challenges or dangers after the second revelation and decision with the antagonist. The Gate. The gate is the moment when the protagonist enters the final stage of the conflict. It often involves crossing a physical or symbolic boundary that separates the ordinary world from the place where the final battle will occur. This step signals that the story is moving directly toward the climax. The Gauntlet. The gauntlet refers to a series of difficult obstacles or attacks that the protagonist must overcome in order to reach the antagonist. The protagonist must use all their strength, intelligence, and courage to pass through these challenges. Visit to Death. The visit to death is a symbolic or emotional moment when the protagonist comes very close to failure, destruction, or death. During this stage, the protagonist is forced to confront their greatest fear or weakness. After surviving these extreme trials, the protagonist becomes fully prepared for the final confrontation with the antagonist. This stage often represents the ultimate test of the protagonist's determination and transformation. Importance in storytelling. The Gate, Gauntlet, and Visit to Death increase the dramatic intensity of the story and build strong suspense before the climax. It shows that the protagonist must face their greatest challenges and overcome their deepest fears before they can confront the antagonist and resolve the central conflict. 17. Third Revelation and Decision. The third revelation and decision is a crucial moment when the protagonist discovers the final and most important piece of information about the conflict. This revelation gives the protagonist a complete understanding of the situation and leads them to make a decisive choice about how to confront the antagonist. The final discovery. At this stage, the protagonist uncovers a major truth or hidden connection that was previously unknown. This discovery may reveal the antagonist's true plan or motive, the real cause of the central conflict, a hidden relationship between characters, the final clue needed to defeat the opponent. This revelation allows the protagonist to finally see the full picture of the conflict. A decisive decision. After learning this truth, the protagonist makes an important and decisive decision. Unlike earlier decisions in the story, this choice directly prepares the protagonist for the final confrontation with the antagonist. The protagonist now knows what must be done and commits fully to that course of action. Preparing for the climax. The third revelation and decision lead the story toward the climax. The protagonist gathers their strength, resources, or allies and moves forward to face the opponent. This moment marks the transition from investigation and struggle to final action. Character understanding. This revelation may also help the protagonist understand their own weakness and need more clearly. By connecting the truth of the conflict with their personal journey, the protagonist becomes more prepared for the self-revelation that will occur later in the story. Importance in storytelling. The third revelation and decision are important because they bring clarity to the narrative and push the story directly toward the final battle. At this point, the protagonist is no longer confused or uncertain. They now understand the conflict and are ready to face the ultimate challenge. 18. Battle. The battle is the moment of the final confrontation between the protagonist and the antagonist. This stage represents the climax of the story, where the central conflict reaches its highest level of intensity. Direct confrontation. During the battle, the protagonist finally faces the antagonist directly. All the tension, struggles, and conflicts that have been building throughout the story now come together in this decisive moment. Both characters fight to achieve their goals, and the outcome of this confrontation will determine who succeeds and who fails. The ultimate test. The battle serves as the ultimate test for the protagonist. Everything the protagonist has learned during the story, including new skills, knowledge, courage, and emotional growth, is used in this moment. The protagonist must also confront their inner weakness while fighting the external opponent. High stakes. At this point in the story, the stakes are at their highest. Because of these high stakes, the battle becomes the most intense and dramatic part of the narrative. Resolution of the conflict. The battle determines the winner of the central conflict. Usually, the protagonist finds a way to overcome the antagonist, but the victory often requires sacrifice, courage, or moral strength. The result of the battle leads directly to the next stage of the story, which is the self-revelation, where the protagonist fully understands the meaning of their journey. Importance in storytelling. The battle is important because it delivers the emotional and dramatic payoff of the entire story. It resolves the central struggle and shows whether the protagonist has truly changed and become capable of overcoming the antagonist. 19. Self-revelation. Self-revelation is the moment when the protagonist finally understands the truth about themselves. It is the point where the character recognizes their deepest weakness, mistake, or misunderstanding about life. The moment of realization. Throughout the story, the protagonist has been struggling to achieve an external goal. However, during the self-revelation, the protagonist realizes that the real problem was within themselves. This moment allows the character to understand their psychological or moral weakness, the mistakes they made during the story, the truth they failed to see earlier. This realization is often the emotional core of the entire story. Internal change. Self-revelation represents the protagonist's internal transformation. The character now understands how they must change in order to become a better person. The protagonist now sees life in a new and deeper way. Connection to the entire story. The self-revelation is connected to everything that happened earlier in the story. The struggles, conflicts, and failures all lead to this moment of understanding. Without these experiences, the protagonist would not have been able to reach this realization. Importance in storytelling. Self-revelation is important because it provides the true meaning of the story. While the external conflict is resolved in the battle, the self-revelation shows how the protagonist has changed internally. This moment gives the story its emotional depth and thematic significance. 20. Moral decision. Moral decision is the moment when the protagonist acts based on the truth they have discovered during the self-revelation. After realizing their weakness and understanding the deeper truth about themselves, the protagonist must now make a crucial moral choice. Acting on the self-revelation. The self-revelation gives the protagonist a new understanding of their character and values. However, this realization alone is not enough. The protagonist must prove their transformation through action. The moral decision shows whether the protagonist has truly changed. Choosing between right and wrong. At this stage, the protagonist faces a situation where they must choose between selfish desire and moral responsibility, personal gain and the well-being of others, old habits and new values. The choice they make reflects the true growth of their character, demonstrating character transformation. If the protagonist chooses the moral path, it shows that they have overcome their earlier weakness. Their decision proves that the experiences of the story have changed their beliefs and behavior. Sometimes this decision may require sacrifice, courage, or compassion. Impact on the story. The moral decision often influences the final outcome of the story. It can determine the fate of other characters and shape the resolution of the conflict. Through this decision, the protagonist demonstrates their true identity and values. Importance in storytelling. The moral decision is important because it turns internal realization into meaningful action. It shows the audience that the protagonist's journey was not only about achieving an external goal, but also about becoming a better and more morally aware person. 21. New equilibrium. New equilibrium is the final stage of the story where a new balance or order is established after the central conflict has been resolved. This stage shows how the protagonist's journey has changed their life and the world around them. A new balance in the story world. At the beginning of the story, the protagonist lived in an ordinary but imperfect world. After going through conflicts, struggles, and personal transformation, the story reaches a point where a new and different balance is created. This new equilibrium reflects the outcome of the protagonist's actions and decisions. The result of the journey. The new equilibrium shows the long-term consequences of the story's events. The protagonist may now live with a new understanding of life, have improved relationships with others, achieve a new role or position in society. Sometimes the protagonist gains success or peace, while in other stories they may accept loss or sacrifice but still achieve personal growth. Reflection of character transformation. The new equilibrium highlights how the protagonist has changed as a person. The character who appears at the end of the story is usually very different from the one at the beginning. Their experiences, struggles, and moral decisions have shaped a new identity and perspective. Closure for the audience. This stage also provides closure for the audience. It allows viewers to see the final state of the story world and understand the meaning of the protagonist's journey. Importance in storytelling. The new equilibrium is important because it completes the narrative arc. It shows that the conflict has been resolved and that the protagonist's transformation has created a new and stable situation in the story world. 22. Legacy. After the new equilibrium is established, the story may show the long-term impact of the protagonist's transformation on the world and other characters. This step focuses on the legacy of the protagonist's journey, how their actions continue to influence the story world even after the central conflict has ended. Meaning of the step. While the new equilibrium shows a new balance in the present, the legacy step looks slightly beyond the ending and reveals what the protagonist's journey ultimately means for the future. Elements of the legacy step. This stage might show 1. How other characters have changed because of the protagonist. 2. How the society or world has been affected. 3. How the protagonist's values continue to shape the future. 4. The symbolic meaning of the journey. These moments show that the story's impact extends beyond the immediate ending.